All right, so buckle up, everyone, because we are diving headfirst into one of the most confusing conflicts in recent history, the Syrian civil war. But get this. This isn't your typical war story.
Oh, definitely not.
This is about unraveling the mystery of how this group, they call themselves HTS, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham.
Right.
They basically took control of the Syrian government, and get this, in just 12 days.
Yeah, it's wild.
12 days? How is that even possible? That's what we are going to try and figure out today. Now, this isn't about, the good guys versus the bad guys. It's way more complicated than that.
Way more.
This is about economies going haywire, countries fighting for power on a global stage, and a whole bunch of stuff nobody saw coming. You might even be surprised to find out who really lost out in this whole power shift.
Oh, yeah.
It's not who you might think.
Not at all. Just how did a group that practically nobody had even heard of manage to pull this off? It wasn't some slow decline. It was like, bam, everything changed overnight.
Yeah, like an earthquake.
Exactly.
Right.
And the craziest part, nobody predicted it.
I know, right? So how did HTS go from basically nobodies to running things in Damascus? Well, to get that, we've got to go back to what Syria was like before the war started. Now, you might be surprised to hear this, but Syria was doing pretty well, economically speaking.
Really?
Yeah. Back in 2011, their GDP was actually twice as big as China's. I mean, President Assad, not exactly a popular guy.
Not really, no.
But under his leadership, their economy, it was actually growing.
That's what makes the whole thing even more mind-blowing, right? Syria wasn't some country on the verge of collapse.
Right.
They had a government that, for the most part, worked, and their economy was on the up and up. So what in the world happened? How did it all go so wrong so fast?
That is the million-dollar question. Well, our sources say that a huge part of it comes down to other countries getting involved.
The whole foreign intervention thing.
Yeah, the U.S., the U.K., France, they all played a part in basically crushing Syria's economy. Our sources paint a pretty grim picture. By 2023, their GDP, it had plummeted. It was down to a measly $100 billion US. Government workers, they were making something like $11 US a month.
You can't live on that.
You can barely survive on that, let alone try to run a whole country.
And think about it. You're a Syrian citizen just trying to make ends meet, right? The economy's in the tank. You can't afford to feed your family. And the government, well, they're failing. Then this group, HTS, comes along promising a better future, a change. I mean, it's easy to see why people might be desperate enough to listen.
Yeah, that kind of desperation, it's ripe for exploitation.
Absolutely.
It's like that old saying, when people are desperate, they'll believe anything.
It's true. And this economic chaos, it had a domino effect.
Yeah.
It messed up everything, even the Syrian military. Imagine being a soldier in that army, already underpaid, morale's low, and then you see your buddies getting laid off because the government can't even afford to pay its own soldiers.
Right, like, would you want to fight for that government?
I don't think so.
Yeah.
And then to make matters even worse, boom, the Russia-Ukraine war breaks out. Russia, who had been Assad's main backer, they suddenly had to shift their focus. And their resources, all those resources going to a whole other conflict, that left Syria hanging without the financial support they were depending on. The Syrian army, once 300,000 strong, it was cut down to less than 80,000 soldiers.
Wow, less than a third of its original size.
It's crucial to understand that all these events, the economic warfare, the Russia-Ukraine war, they weren't just random things happening in isolation.
No.
They had a direct and devastating impact on the situation in Syria. They basically created the perfect storm for a group like HTS to swoop in and exploit the chaos.
Okay, so let's talk about HTS. These guys, they aren't your run-of-the-mill rebel group. Their ideology, it's extreme, even compared to groups like ISIS. We're talking public executions targeting civilians they consider infidels. A really brutal and uncompromising worldview.
Yeah, it's no surprise that they were labeled a terrorist organization by basically everyone, including the U.S., Russia, and the UN.
Exactly. And that brings us to the big mystery at the heart of all this. How in the world did a group with such extreme views, a group condemned by pretty much the entire world, managed to not only survive, but actually thrive in a war-torn country like Syria? And maybe even more importantly, how did they manage to pull off such a fast and decisive victory against a government that, until very recently, had the backing of some of the most powerful countries in the world?
It really is a puzzle.
And here's where it gets even more interesting. The biggest losers in this whole scenario, they aren't just Russia and Iran who lost a key ally.
Right.
The U.S., Israel, Even Turkey, they all wanted Assad gone. But HTS taking over, that throws a massive wrench into everyone's plans.
A huge wrench.
Yeah.
Because HTS, they're not playing by anyone's rules. They're a wild card, totally unpredictable, and a threat to everyone involved. That's why, even though the U.S. and Russia both agree that HTS is a terrorist organization, their goals in Syria were totally different.
It's like everyone was so busy playing their own game that they totally underestimated HTS. They didn't see how this group was using the chaos to their advantage, quietly building up their power while everyone else was fighting each other.
That's the irony of the whole conflict, right? By trying to control the outcome, by intervening so heavily, these global powers unintentionally created the perfect conditions for a group like HTS to come to power.
It really shows you how unpredictable these things can be, and that's where China comes in.
Oh, yeah.
They've always had this policy of non-intervention, which, might seem passive.
Right.
But in this case, it's actually put them in a surprisingly strong position.
I see what you mean.
They didn't get bogged down by all the baggage of past actions or alliances. They haven't been pouring resources into backing specific groups. They haven't taken sides.
All right.
And that gives them a level of flexibility that the other players just don't have. It's like they were playing chess while everyone else was playing checkers.
A much more strategic approach.
Yeah. So while the U.S., Russia, everyone else is trying to figure out what to do next, China, they're in a unique spot. They can engage with whoever comes out on top. That's some serious long-term strategic thinking.
Yeah, their non-intervention policy, it's actually given them a unique advantage.
It has.
They can now step in, maybe even act as a mediator.
Right, be a voice of reason.
Exactly, a voice of reason in a region that desperately needs one.
Okay, so we've established that HTS's rise to power was fast, it was brutal, and it caught everyone off guard. But the big question still remains. How did they actually pull it off? How did a group that everyone called terrorists manage to build an army of 40,000 loyal fighters in a country as economically devastated as Syria? That's what we'll be looking at next. So I bet you're wondering how HTS managed to pull together an army out of basically nothing.
Yet the head scratcher.
In a country as messed up by war as Syria, 40,000 fighters.
It's a lot.
That's a serious force, especially for a group that not that long ago was considered pretty fringe.
That's the real puzzle here, right? Their funding, where their support's coming from inside Syria, how powerful their ideology really is, it's all kind of a black box.
It's almost like they materialized out of thin air. Fully formed, armed, and ready to grab power. Think about it, to convince thousands of people who are probably exhausted, disillusioned after years of war and hardship, to convince them to join their cause, that's a heck of a feat.
It suggests a level of organization and planning that, frankly, I don't think we fully appreciate yet. It's like we're missing pieces of the puzzle. We see the result, this crazy takeover, but we don't really get the how, the why.
Yeah, it challenges a lot of what we thought we knew about how power works in that region. And it reminds us that sometimes the groups we understand the least are the ones we should be most worried about. But beyond the how, the big question is, what's next?
But right now, Syria, it's like a powder keg.
Ready to blow.
HTS might have taken the capital, but they're surrounded by enemies on all sides. There's what's left of the Syrian army, various rebel groups, the Kurdish forces who have the U.S. backing them, and you can't forget about Israel. They're watching very closely from the border.
It's like a giant game of Risk, where nobody's quite sure the rules anymore, or even who's on their team. So, being realistic, what are the odds that HTS can actually hold on to power?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Their ideology is not exactly known for being flexible or for compromising. No. These guys, they aren't interested in sharing power, negotiating any of that.
No.
They believe they're the rightful rulers, destined to, rule Syria according to their very strict interpretation of Islamic law.
Which I'm guessing is bad news for anyone in Syria who doesn't see things their way.
You got it.
Even those groups that were fighting against Assad, I bet they aren't too keen on living under HTS rule.
Exactly. And that's why things are so tense right now. You've got all these different factions, each with their own goals, their own grudges, all crammed into a country that's already been shattered by years of war. It's basically a recipe for even more conflict.
And possibly even worse than what we've seen already. So what's the most likely outcome here? Is it going to be every group for themselves, a free-for-all, or could we see some, uneasy alliances forming?
It's hard to say for sure, but one thing's clear. It's about to get really messy. The old alliances, the way power used to work, that's all out the window. We're entering a whole new phase in this conflict, and it's even more unpredictable, even more dangerous.
What about the big players, the global powers? Are we going to see a repeat of those proxy wars that fueled this conflict for so long? Or are they going to realize that getting directly involved just made things worse and back off?
I think there's a growing sense, even among people who are usually all for intervention, that things in Syria are getting out of control. Like, take the U.S., they're already under pressure to pull back their support for the Kurdish forces.
Yeah, who are now right in HTS's crosshair.
Exactly. And Russia, after having their ally basically toppled in less than 2 weeks, they're probably having to rethink their whole strategy.
That's got to be a blow to the ego.
For sure. So if the big guys are hesitant to jump back in, who does that leave?
That's a good question.
Well, remember what we talked about earlier. China, they're in a surprisingly good spot right now. Their policy of non-intervention, their focus on economics instead of military alliances, it makes them potentially a really good mediator.
Yeah, someone who can bring everyone to the table.
A voice of reason. And that's something that region desperately needs.
So it's kind of ironic China's hands-off approach might be the key to stabilizing Syria.
It's definitely possible. They've got the economic clout, the diplomatic channels, and they don't have all the baggage of past interventions that the other powers have.
I get that, but let's be honest. We're talking about a country that's been ravaged by war, where a pretty extreme group just took over. Even if China steps up, can they really change things? Can they turn this whole situation around?
It's a massive challenge, there's no doubt about that. But if this whole thing has taught us anything, it's that you can't predict what's going to happen. Sometimes the most unlikely players end up being the key to the future.
Okay, let's shift gears back to HTS for a minute. They defied all expectations, they took down a government, they seized control of a country, but here's the big question. Can they actually govern? Can they go from being revolutionaries to actually running a country?
That's the question that's going to determine Syria's future. Because holding on to power is one thing, but building a nation, especially one as broken and traumatized as Syria, that's a whole different ballgame. And it's a challenge that HTS, with their extreme ideology and brutal tactics, well, they might not be equipped to handle it.
So what does this mean for the people of Syria? What's their future going to look like under HTS rule?
Honestly, it's not a pretty picture. This is a group that's openly hostile to anything that even resembles democracy or individual freedom. They've already started putting harsh restrictions on women's rights, freedom of speech, religious freedom.
That sounds like a nightmare for anyone who doesn't fit into their very, very narrow worldview.
Exactly. And the rest of the world is already noticing. Human rights groups are warning about widespread abuses. And there's a lot of concern about a massive wave of refugees trying to escape the persecution and violence.
It's a tragedy. There's no other way to put it. A country that was once a center of culture and diversity is now controlled by extremists who seem determined to rule through fear and oppression.
And the saddest part is, this isn't just about politics or ideology. This is about real people, millions of them caught in the middle of this. They've already been through years of war and suffering, and now their future looks even worse.
So, what can we do? Is there any hope for a better outcome here? Or are we just watching another dark chapter unfold in Syria's long and troubled history? What do the sources say about this?
It's tough. It's really tough to see past all the doom and gloom when you look at what's going on in Syria. But even amidst all the chaos, all the uncertainty, there's another story happening, a story about how resilient the Syrian people are. And I don't think our sources really delve into it that deeply. But
they touch on it.
They do. They touch on it, yeah.
Yeah, it's true. It's easy to get caught up in the big picture stuff, the geopolitics and military strategy.
Right.
But we can't forget about the people, their resilience, their ingenuity, the way they just refuse to give up even when faced with incredible hardship. It's an amazing story.
Yeah, and we've seen glimpses of that all throughout this conflict. Doctors working in hospitals that have been bombed, teachers setting up classrooms and shelters, entire communities helping each other out, even though there's this constant threat of violence.
It's pretty inspiring.
It really is. And that spirit, that refusal to be broken, that's what gives me hope for Syria. Because long after the fighting stops and the world kind of moves on, it's the Syrian people who are going to be left to pick up the pieces.
So what does rebuilding even look like in a situation like this? I mean, can a country heal? Can it reconcile after so much bloodshed and division? I'm having a hard time even imagining it.
That's the question that hangs over every conflict, right? How do you bridge the divides? How do you move past all the hatred and trauma that war leaves behind? There's no easy answer, no quick fix.
Right.
But if we look back at history, we see that even in societies that have been totally devastated, hope can find a way. We've seen it in Rwanda, In Bosnia, countries that have come back from genocide and civil war.
So what is it that sparks that hope? Where does it come from in a place like Syria?
Sometimes it comes from the most unexpected places.
Yeah.
A community leader who reaches out to someone from a different sect, a young artist who expresses the pain and the longing for peace through their art, or even just a group of women coming together to rebuild their neighborhood one brick at a time.
It's those small acts of courage, those quiet moments of humanity.
Yeah.
They're the things that pave the way for a better future. It shows you that even in the darkest of times, people still have the ability to hope, to care for each other.
Exactly. And it's crucial to remember that even though things look pretty bleak in Syria right now, the story's not over. The Syrian people, they've been through hell, but they've also shown incredible strength. Their story is a testament to what the human spirit can endure, and its ability to survive, to adapt, to even forgive.
It's a powerful reminder that even when things seem hopeless, there's always the possibility for change. So while we may not have all the answers about what's going to happen in Syria, we can hold on to that hope. Hope for a future where the Syrian people can finally rebuild their lives, rebuild their country.
Absolutely. And if you found this deep dive interesting, I encourage you to keep digging. Learn more about the Middle East, about the people there, their stories, their struggles. Because the story of Syria, it's not over yet. And the stakes, they couldn't be higher.
And that's it for this episode of The Deep Dive. We'll be back soon with another deep dive into a topic that's shaping our world. See you then.